Do you know the difference between horsepower and torque? Do you know what each of them represent? I myself didn't learn the answer to either of those questions until I had already been into cars for a few years. Now, albeit I was quite young when I first got into cars, so I'll give myself a pass for not realizing it immediately. I really became curious about the difference when I started taking my first physics courses in high school, which actually was the start of a much longer physics journey. Our discussion here will draw on some basic physics concepts, so don't worry, I'll explain everything, though I'd be lying if I said that a physics or engineering background wouldn't help you out. Now, what is torque? Torque is a kind of force, specifically a rotational force, and a force is defined as either a push or pull on an object. To better understand this, picture yourself using a ratchet or a wrench to tighten a nut onto a bolt. As you turn the ratchet, it applies a rotational force to the nut, causing it to spin on the bolt. In this example, the ratchet is applying torque to the nut. This is also where the phrase torque it down comes from. Now, you're probably wondering what all of this rotational nonsense has to do with engines, but luckily for you, that's what my next paragraph is about. Your engine is constantly rotating. That's why you have a revolutions per minute or RPMs gauge in your car, or at least on most cars. As fuel is injected and ignited, these explosions push the pistons down, which turn the crankshaft. The rotational motion of your crankshaft is then propagated to the wheels through your drivetrain, and it will pass through your torque converter, transmission, driveshaft differentials, and so on until it reaches the wheels. And if you want to, you can check out my previous video about torque converters. So the torque of an engine can be thought of as a rotational force the engine exerts on the wheels. That's why torque is often associated with towing capacity. Imagine a car is stuck in snow and a pickup truck is trying to pull it out. In order to do this, a pickup truck would need to exert a large amount of force on its wheels to get them to rotate and move forward with the dead weight of the car, assuming traction isn't an issue. This is why pickup trucks tend to have larger amounts of torque and is part of the reason why diesel motors are often found in bigger and stronger pickup trucks. It's because they tend to be able to produce more torque than most gas engines. As you can likely infer, this also has an impact on how quickly a car can accelerate. If an engine can generate a large amount of torque at a low RPM, it will be able to accelerate faster. This is because at low speeds, the engine is capable of exerting a large rotational force on the wheels, causing the car to move faster. In the metric system and most scientific applications, torque is measured in units of Newton meters. Now, some of you may recall that forces are typically measured in units of newtons, which is correct, but torque is a rotational force, meaning it's a force applied through some rotational axis. Therefore, it's measured in units of force and distance, hence Newton meters. However, in America, torque is measured in units of pound-feet, or, well, I guess pound-feet is the only way to really say that. And this has become kind of pretty well accepted in the car community, so we'll roll with it. I'll end this section off by saying that when interpreting torque numbers, you should care about both what the maximum torque is and at what RPM it's achieved. As I mentioned above, for a car to accelerate quickly, you'd want it to both have a large amount of torque and achieve peak torque at a low RPM. The 11th gen Civic Si, which I also have a previous video about and a blog article about, makes peak torque at about 1800 RPM, which is great, but it only makes 192 pound-feet of torque. So it won't feel like a fast car, it really isn't, but it will feel like it has a much bigger engine than it really does and still be surprisingly quick. This is because although there isn't a lot of torque, it does come in very quickly at 1800 RPM. Now imagine what a large V8 engine could do, making easily double the torque of the Civic Si and at low RPMs as well. Now we'll move on to what is horsepower. Horsepower is a measure of power, and power represents the rate of change of work over time. Now, work can be thought of as the application of a force through a distance. And before you attack me, keyboard warriors, I know this isn't the textbook definition of work. I spent several years studying physics, but I actually simplified this definition intentionally just so most people will be able to understand, even if they don't have a physics or engineering background. And now with that out of the way, we can get back to talking about horsepower. So in the context of engines, horsepower can be thought of as a measure of the engine's ability to apply a force through a distance over a certain amount of time. In the metric system, power is measured in units of watts, and horsepower is usually measured in units of watts or Fürtestarke. And this is why Koenigsegg says that the one-to-one produces a megawatt of power. I also have a previous video about the one-to-one and an article about it, so go check those out if you want to. And in America, horsepower, believe it or not, is measured in units of horsepower. And 1 horsepower is equivalent to about 750 watts, or 550 pound-feet per second, which represents a force of 550 pounds acting across 1 foot in 1 second. So what does this mean in the context of engines? Horsepower is the rate at which torque is applied, or the rate at which torque does work. Torque can be thought of as the strength of a rotational force being applied to the wheels, and horsepower can be thought of as how quickly that force is applied to the wheels. The last thing to consider is the time aspect. Since horsepower is a measure of how quickly torque is applied, we need a time component. The time component comes in the form of your engine RPMs. Thus, horsepower is a function of both torque and RPMs. Horsepower can be computed through the following formula, where horsepower is equal to torque times your RPMs divided by 5,252. Now, this equation states that if torque was constant throughout the power band, the horsepower of a vehicle must rise as the RPMs rise as well. Now, you likely realize that horsepower and torque are directly linked to the performance of an engine, and neither of them can act independently. To consider the effects of one of them, you'd need to fix the other stable, or constant. If we had two cars with the exact same amount of torque, but one had more horsepower, the one with more horsepower would be able to accelerate faster, reaching a higher top speed, assuming that weight, drivetrain, and everything other than horsepower is identical between them. This is because a car with more horsepower is able to generate and apply torque faster than the other car. You'd want a towing vehicle to have low horsepower and high torque. This is because you don't necessarily want to generate all of that torque as fast as possible, and they want to have a lot of torque at lower RPMs, whereas sports cars will generally have higher horsepower and lower torque as they aim to generate more power at higher RPMs. Now, if you recall that formula, it showed us that horsepower and RPMs are directly proportional to each other. So if you want to have more torque at lower RPMs, you don't necessarily need more horsepower. And I feel like I also need to say that there is much more to performance than horsepower and torque. What I've shown you also is a heavily simplified explanation. Things like, gear ratios, power bands, weight, engine stroke, and a whole bunch of other things play a role in performance and would need to be considered. And we are at the end of this video, but worry not, there will be another one up next week. As always, feel free to take a look around my blog or my YouTube channel or my TikTok or my Instagram, which are at SharksAuto, and my blog is www.sharksauto.com. Please comment, like, subscribe, and if you want to, you can send me an email at sharksauto@gmail.com. Thank you, and I will see you guys again next week.